also on the board of Animal Justice. And just before we take questions from the audience, I was just going to ask each of you maybe to just give briefly an immediate reaction to the play. If there was a particular character or scene that resonated with you, just a personal reaction.
Well, I personally thought the play was really good. I really enjoyed it. I think one of the things that really resonated with me was the keeper's sort of love for the elephant, which I think is probably true, that the people who work with the animals do love them. And that, but I think they get over involved in it, and I sort of got that too. I like the way that she became just too attached.
Yeah, it's funny, I picked up the same thing. It was a very powerful thing to watch, and I do have my own perspectives on this matter, and getting a chance to watch how the keeper felt about it, especially in the opening parts, and the way in which it became a conflict in between the zoo and the protesters was really resonated, and I thought was portrayed exceptionally well. And I do think there is a real love from the zookeepers. I've heard that many times before, and the way in which that love is used to sort of rationalize what goes on. And as some of the real truth started to seep in, so that she felt more conflicted, was, I think, a very realistic conflict that many of us feel when we think about zoos. I am not an advocate for zoos, and yet I can understand the conflict that some have in respect of thinking about how to deal with them.
So if we have any questions from the audience, we can take them at this point. I might have a little trouble seeing you, so if anybody has a question, they can just call out if I don't see your hand up. If not, then, so Tove, I know you have been involved in 2 court actions, one against the city of Edmonton and one against the province. And I was just wondering, in the play, the protesters are collecting signatures, petition, that sort of approach to try to change the life of the elephant in the zoo. And I was just wondering what inspired you to take the action through the courts, to try and use a court action.
Well, I think initially you want to raise awareness and get the people of Edmonton behind you, and to try and make people understand sort of what the problems are with having an elephant, a lone elephant in a zoo in a cold climate like Edmonton. And eventually I think you have to take the next step, which is to try and, we tried to work with the city of Edmonton and they just weren't listening. And in our first court action, and we tried to talk to various city councillors and couldn't get anybody on side. And finally we decided that probably the only way to make them listen was to go to court.
And so I know that, at least my understanding is, the action against the city has sort of reached an end. It went to the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeal in Alberta, and was denied. Now I understand it was denied as a misuse of the court action, and I was wondering if maybe Peter could explain a little bit about what that decision was about.
Sure. I mean, the problem with advocating on behalf of an animal is just that our legal system doesn't recognize animals as having a legal personality. So the nature of the court case was really an attempt to force the city really to enforce its own standards, or force the province to enforce the standards at the zoo and under the Animal Protection Act, and ensure that the action against that Lucy could be properly evaluated and taken care of. And I think that the challenge in doing that, or the challenge that Tove is finding as she's going through the courts a second time, is that the courts do not have the greatest of recognition for animals and their interests. And I think what they do is, unfortunately, all animals are treated as property of humans. And as a result, trying to go in to advocate on their behalf in a courtroom is incredibly challenging. And it's challenging both procedurally and substantively, and those are two separate things. The substantive question is really whether Lucy is receiving the benefits of the Animal Protection Act in a nutshell, but also, in a broader sense, whether her care is being taken care of or whether she's better off in some other environment. But the problem is that it is impossible to get the courts to, well, I don't want to say impossible, that's probably a little premature, but it's very difficult to get the courts to even address the substantive question until they deal with the procedural question. And the procedural question is, well, what rights do we have as third-party bystanders, as the court would say, to get the courts to be interested in that question, and whether or not, I don't think that's the specific question in this case, but it's certainly being raised in similar litigation down south, what rights does anybody have to speak on an elephant or any other animal's behalf in order to get the substantive question asked? And the problem, this is a long-winded explanation, as I see it, is that the courts have been unwilling to allow third parties or any party to speak on behalf of the animal itself to even challenge decisions made by governments or zoos about what's in the best interest. So in effect, what happens is the decisions made by either the city or the province or whoever it is in the particular case becomes conclusive. And that is the difficulty, trying to knock down that door, which is what Tove and others are trying to do in the courtroom.
Are there any questions at this point? We're happy to answer. Okay, go ahead.
I understand animal justice is working on a charter of rights. I'm just wondering what progress there is there, what the plans are.
So the idea of the Charter of Rights for Animals is a very, it's more a notional idea than a legal idea, in the sense of the idea of the Charter of Rights for Animals is really to push a different way of thinking about animals and a way of getting people to think about animals in a different way. Let's just say that the idea of getting a Charter of Rights in a constitutional sense as a protected interests of animals is really a political venture more than a legal one. The legal steps that are being taken to try and obtain rights for animals were actually in a very interesting time. I mean, the action that Tove is bringing through Voices for Animals and other groups is an important way of trying to challenge the status quo and think about a different way of looking at animal interests. And I'm hoping she's going to ultimately be successful. She's put enough work in, and so have the others. And as I suggested earlier, there are groups in the U.S. right now that are trying to advocate on behalf of the animals themselves, going directly to the source. And that is not easy to do. The courts are very resistant to these types of actions, especially in the early days. But the fact that these actions are being taken gives me hope that in the relatively near future, the courts will look at these things differently. Because unfortunately, until we can get through the procedural question, there is no way to get to any of these substantive issues. And the only way to get through the procedural question is to show that these animals have interests that need to be defended by the courts. Because that's ultimately what the courts are there for. So I'm optimistic that in some fashion that will eventually happen.
Just to actually expanding on that, your comments about trying to get through the procedural question. I know that the dissenting opinion in the case against the Court of Appeal for your case with the city, I'm not a legal expert, but I've heard lawyer friends say that the dissenting opinion that was written by the Chief Justice was quite profound. And I'm just wondering for you, Tove, and maybe you as well, Peter, if you can just comment on a little bit about what her dissenting opinion was and what it meant for you in your efforts.
Yeah, she was, like, her opinion was really sympathetic to our side. And I think she really understood that the public has a right to take these cases forward and to speak for animals, because, like, I think she said in her dissent that if we don't do it, like, who will? And, you know, because, I mean, obviously the elephant can't speak for herself. And so she definitely felt that we had a right to do that. And I think that came through very clearly in her dissent.
Yeah, there were a lot of powerful things about the dissent that spring to my mind, but just to sum up like what I think happened and what it was she was talking about, she certainly, to be clear, was not deciding that Lucy needed to move, or there was none of that. It was a preliminary procedural question of whether or not the public or members of the public had the right to challenge a decision that was essentially being made by people who, in a sense, have a vested interest in what actually the outcome actually is. And the real question, the broader question, was whether or not we citizens had the right to challenge governmental decisions that were made in you know, public decisions that were made that were failing to enforce their own legislation. That was the real question. And the majority said you don't have the right to do that. Third parties don't have the right to do that, and these interests are to be decided by government. And what the minority really looked at was, it was really a new way of looking at it. It was almost this recognition that if these animals, we say they're important, but then even when we see evidence to the contrary of their importance and the way they're treated, we just let governments make those decisions and we don't have any right to do anything. And she said that's just not right. The courts were designed to allow important cognizable interests to be litigated. And of all the many things she said, to me the most poignant was what she was recognizing was what happened to Lucy was important. And that needed to be something that was within the providence of the courts. And effectively, the way I read the majority judgment was, well, you can't do this. It's just, you know, government gets to do what it wants. Animal interests are not recognized in any other way, so the government's decision stands.
Do we have any other questions? Yes.
What about other countries and other situations? For example, I think in New Zealand, wasn't a river given its rights? And I mean, that's even less sentient than an animal.
I think,
I mean, we're obviously not there yet here. You know, we're still fighting for an animal that's as intelligent and as social and, you know, family-oriented as an elephant. And she has no rights. You know, even under the law, which says that, like the provincial animal or zoo regulation says that elephants or animals have to be kept in groupings that are natural to them. And the zoo is violating that with Lucy. And even that isn't enough to, you know, to make, well, the province do anything about it to enforce their own laws.
But don't courts look to other courts for precedents?
Sure, there's no question that they will, keeping in mind the different context of every different country. So some of the rulings that take place in New Zealand where they are looking at, that ruling looks at, for example, the Aboriginal context in New Zealand and the way in which the Aboriginals, in a sense, the river's right stems from the Aboriginal right to the land. But there's no question that what's happening around the world every day is changing the way in which we recognize animals, and those concepts have a tendency to ultimately, again, I like to be optimistic, be reflected. It just takes time. And to be honest, we don't need to look that far abroad, because as we sit here today, To my mind, one of the most important pieces of legislation in Canadian history for animals is going through Parliament. And I say that because while we're talking about elephants, a very important problem, no question about it, the law governing marine mammals is going through Parliament. And what's so interesting about the legislation involving marine mammals is, for my money, it is the first piece of legislation in this country that actually has provisions in it that are solely and exclusively about the benefit of the animal. And that, I don't think, has ever happened in this country. And what I mean by that is, all of the animal protection laws that we have in this country, including the ones governing elephants and other primates, they have this sort of idea that, yes, we have to do what's in the best interest of the animal, but we also have to balance that against what's in the best interest of the human. And to be honest, that sort of came through in some of the discussions in the play. That's very common. All Canadian laws, anti-cruelty, welfare, whatever you want to call them, do that. But what's really interesting, if you read the marine mammal law and what they're trying to pass, what caught my eye was not so much the ban on marine mammals. That's great in itself and wonderful. But there's a subclause that says, if we are going to keep a marine mammal in captivity, it's got to be for the benefit of that animal, right? And no balance. It's just, you can only do it. The only exception is when it is clearly to the benefit of the animal. And that is much more along the lines of rights thinking. It's much more along the lines of what's in the best interest of the animal. That is not what takes place with elephants and other animals in zoos today. They may talk that talk, but the law does not require any zoo in this country, certainly not the Edmonton Zoo, to do what's in the best interest of Lucy. And I'm not saying they're not doing that within their own minds or what they think based on what we saw, but what I'm saying is the law doesn't say that. It just says they can't keep them in ways that is, going to cause them distress and pain and suffering. It's not what's best for them. And I think these concepts that are evolving are very important to changing our way of thinking about all animals.
Good question. Do we have any more questions? Yes.
And I don't want to open a huge thing, but I'm curious about, you mentioned zoos, that you weren't an advocate. And I have limited knowledge of zoos. I haven't been to many of them, but like San Diego, White Oak Conservation in Florida, there are, it seems to me, some groups that are working really hard to conserve species. Can you speak to that?
There's a really poor record of conservation in zoos. I just read recently that of all zoos, about 3% of all zoos are attempting to get the best conditions possible for the animals in the zoo, and only a handful of them have actually managed to do that. And when you look at the number of animals that have been, rescued by zoos and returned to the wild, you can count them on one hand. And a zoo is just not an appropriate place to rehabilitate animals to be returned. They've lost all the skills that they need to live in the wild, and they don't know how to find food. They don't know how to deal with predators, all that kind of stuff. So zoos have a really poor record of conservation, and that claim is, it's just whitewash. It's meant to, I think, make us all feel better about zoos, and in many ways, I think they've done a very good job of getting that message out, because I think a lot of people do think that is sort of a major part of the zoo, of what zoos do, is conservation, and that's simply not true.
Any more questions?
Don't obviously be saying time, but we'll have one more question. This will be the last question.
I couldn't resist just thinking about animals in captivity, and of course every time we have our lone elephant. What are the laws that allow, for example, a shopping mall to
So it's much easier to say what the law doesn't allow, because that's the easier way to deal with it. Because the starting point is, as crazy as this sounds, in theory, subject to what I'm about to say, any person can own any animal in this country, and lots of people do. That's why we have, you've all heard probably of the IKEA monkey case. That was the case of a woman, who owns a monkey and loses it in Toronto. And the only reason she lost it in Toronto after it got loose in IKEA was because the city of Toronto, the municipality, did not allow that type of animal to be in the city. So what she did was she just moved outside of the city limits. That's what she did. And now she's got her own little quasi-zoo there. I mean, it's not a zoo because it's not open to the public, but she's got all kinds of animals. I mean, there are animals in private holdings just about all over the country because the federal government has refused to put in any overarching law that prohibits the ownership of particular animals. And let's just be honest, it is hard to get your hands on a tiger, a lion. It's just not easy to get. But I mean, there are lots of species of lots of animals in private holdings across the country. And as for zoos, well, many of these places just say, well, why don't we just open a zoo? And Alberta, believe it or not, is the only province in the country with any type of zoo regulation. And if we talk about the flaws and loopholes in that zoo regulation, we'd be here all day. So let's just hope to try and agree for the moment that there are some flaws to it. But keep that in mind, it's the only province in the country. So in Ontario and other provinces in Quebec, where I'm from, there's just all these little private zoos that exist and they all have animals. Well, the accreditation standards of CAZA is not a government body to begin with. CAZA is an association by which if you want to be a member of CAZA and have some sort of recognition, right, from CAZA, then you can join CAZA and theoretically have to adhere to its regulations. But I mean, as I understand it, I don't think Gazoo was ever a member of CAZA. No. So like lots of these private zoos, these smaller zoos, all these little roadside stands, they just ignore CAZA because they don't have to belong to CAZA. And the provinces and the federal government have just completely abdicated their role in trying to govern over exotic animals. The only things that stop or govern any treatment of animals in any of these places, with the exception of Alberta, which does have this zoo regulation, is essentially the federal anti-cruelty law, which I can tell you is virtually useless for these types of situations. It does absolutely nothing. It's a very poor law. And then you have the provincial distress laws, which are moderately more useful in the worst case situations. And the bottom line is, that's why, again, to return to this law on marine mammals, it wasn't much different with marine mammals. We're talking about orca and dolphins in captivity, and the laws were essentially just the same laws that govern your treatment of your dog or your cat. It's a ludicrous situation, and it stems from the fact that, in truth, we just don't care enough about our animals to regulate their use. That's the bottom line. Sorry, that was long.
Well, I just wanted to say quickly that I think, organizations like CASA, which is a zoo-run industry or organization, they do so much more harm than good because I think a lot of people believe that they don't know that they're an industry organization, and so they think they're actually there for the animals. And we saw that with like Stephen Mandel when he was mayor. He flat out said that as long as the zoo is accredited by CASA, he didn't have any problems. He felt that then everything was okay.
Well, I'm sorry that we have to cut it off, but we do have to adhere to the time so they can start clearing up the stage. But I know I'll let Vern close it out, but I know that people do have a few more minutes in the lobby to continue discussions if they want.
First of all, let's give a round of applause for our guests. Thank you very much.